It was too much. Last night I said, this is too much. This morning I said, this is too much. And now I realize it's too much.
You should not buy this video card, or really probably any of the high-end cards right now. This is the 5070 Ti. It's just the box, it's okay. The market is in chaos. The conditions are at an all-time low for consumers, and it benefits the entire industry, including us, if everybody mindlessly consumes. But we're telling you not to be a part of that cycle. This is not the time to buy an NVIDIA video card. They say this will be $750, but we don't believe it. In fact, some partner models have already been spotted at $1,000, with plenty of others coming in at $850 to $900. We even heard of one partner model that'll have an MSRP above $1,000. That's more than a 4080. That's insane. So NVIDIA says this is an RTX 5070 Ti, but it's really more like an RTX 4080 V3, or V4, if you count the unlaunched 4080 12GB, which was a 4070 Ti. The TLDW up front is that the 5080 is about 12 to 16% better than this in some of the 4K gaming scenarios we tested. The 5070 Ti is about 28 to 35% ahead at best of the 4070 Ti, again in those 4K scenarios, but it comes down into the 20% to 28% range when you're at 1440p. Additionally, the lead over the 4070 Ti Super, which is really the one that's easy to lose track of, but is important because it's the closest sort of price analog from the most recent generation. That is only 7.8% to 20% in a lot of 4K situations, or commonly 12 to 16%. And the worst case one we saw was an impressively bad 3.9% better for the 5070 Ti versus the 4070 Ti Super. So again, based on the pricing we're expecting for launch, and also kind of just the MSRP, we don't think you should buy this video card. Honestly, you shouldn't even really watch this video. See you later if you agree. You'll miss the memes that we've packed into all of the charts. There's some good ones in there. But hey, we're gonna save you the time, and just that's how we feel about it. This is really just not exciting. And part of the problem here is that NVIDIA, while it has become fat and monopolistic, is facing a competitor that has decided it just literally won't even compete in the high end. That's as much as AMD said. And Intel's not there yet. So it's just NVIDIA. And it's so much NVIDIA that the 5080 card to the 4070 card is a difference that has now been subdivided several times, like the 4080 and the 4070 Ti, which was a 4080 12GB originally, already subdivided it. Likewise, the 4080 Super created another subdivision. The 4070 Ti Super created yet another subdivision, and now the 5070 Ti creates a further subdivision. There are so many subdivisions in this block that it'll have an HOA by next week. I'll be here all night. In one of our tests, we saw an average gap between cards in this upper end of 6.7 to 8 FPS card to card, depending on which cards you want to count. What this really means is that the only relevant factor is price, except maybe VRAM in a few places where it diverges, which is becoming fewer. That'll matter more for professional users. But even VRAM has mostly been split into the sort of 90 class and then everyone else. The 5070 Ti is often the same performance as the 4080, which is the same performance as the 4080 Super. It is hardly an improvement over the 4070 Ti Super, which was close to the same MSRP. And this aligns with what has appeared to be NVIDIA's launch strategy of just flooding sort of each category of card. So you got to step every 50 bucks for another couple FPS. Meanwhile, AMD's strategy, because they're not cleaning this either, has apparently been NVIDIA minus $50 equals MSRP. It's a formula so commonplace, they should teach it in math classes now. Anyway, let's get into it. We brought you this video. We figured an unhinged launch required an equally unhinged ad, so we placed our own. You can use code ABOUTFUCKINGTIME for 10% off anything on the store, like our GN15 large anti-static mod mats that we've been selling for about 8 years now. Now is a better time than ever to take apart an old video card and repaste it and maintain it with a clean out to extend its life. And the mod mat gives you a screw tracking diagram and pinouts to make things easier. You might also like our silicone soldering and project mats, which are perfect surfaces to incinerate your 12-volt high power cables on because they're extremely heat resistant mats. The mats are available in a GN blue, yellow, a fire red, and toxic green, which seems fitting today. You might also like our 7-piece sharp edge resin dice kits, with embedded Snowflake the Cat miniatures, or our E-Waste Inductor Series dice with embedded copper coil inductors within each die. Each kit comes with a high-quality wooden box that we designed with an integrated roll tray and with latches, plus either a Snowflake the Cat MTG-style card or Goblin Creature token. Finally, consider our copper-plated stainless steel mule mugs. Worst case, if you don't like it, you can always slap some thermal paste on the bottom and use it to cool your GPU. Head over to store.gamersnexus.net for all of that and more. And remember, use code ABOUTFUCKINGTIME. Now this is the 5070 Ti Asus Prime, which we assume they named it that way because they're trying to get Logan Paul's attention or something. Or maybe it has electrolytes, which the gamers crave. The RTX 5070 Ti has 8960 CUDA cores, 16 gigabytes of GDDR7, and a 256-bit bus. The memory spec is identical to the 5080, with the 5080 having more CUDA cores but being a significant cut down from the 5090, more than we've seen typically. We covered the full specs in a separate video. We'll link that below if you care about that. It's basically the brochure and the spec sheet. Pricing is going to be the biggest problem for this GPU. We made some tables recently that show the price change since launch, which was like a couple weeks ago for the other 50 series card. Sorry, cards. There's technically more than one. I mean, like 2 or 3 is, it does become plural at that point, so. So for the supply being non-existent, the 5090 and 5080, as we showed in our table in the other video, have skyrocketed alongside things like insane combo packs that might not even be compatible with each other to push it all into true FOMO territory. And to accompany its fake frames, NVIDIA's fake prices say the 5070 Ti will launch at MSRP of $750. We know again of one board partner that is north of $1,000 for one of its models. This gets worse considering the lower overall price of $750 means that the proportional price hike from the baseline feels a lot worse, especially as you get into the type of buyer who is going to be trying to target something that would traditionally be considered mid-range, although $750 for a GPU today kind of feels more like what a high-end purchase used to be, and that's even with inflation. But there's really not a lot of ground to cover here that we haven't already at some point. We've got the paper launch video, we have the fake prices video, we have a separate video, I don't know if it'll be up or if it's the nenext day, but for DLSS 4 image quality and stuff like that. So you can check those out if you want all that stuff. Let's just get into the data. Now for the testing today, we had to remove a couple cards from the charts to make some space. We removed the 3090 and the 3090 Ti. If you want the data for those, check the 5080 video. It's got all that, hasn't changed. Now to the first game. In Final Fantasy XIV at 4K, the RTX 5070 Ti landed at 97 FPS average, with lows at 83 and 80. That's the same as an RTX 4080, which under normal conditions might sound like a generational improvement on the arbitrarily named GPUs. Instead, what we have is total generational stagnation, because the 5070 Ti will regularly sell at prices, at least for now, approaching what the 4080 was. Even at only a slight elevation to $850, like for partner models that are on the better end of pricing, the card is simply too close to the last generation performance equivalent. The 7900X TX outperforms the 5070 Ti by 7.4%, with the 5080 16% ahead, and the 5090 87% ahead of the 5070 Ti. As for the 7900X T Hellhound, which was the cheapest partner model for a while, that's at 82 FPS. Generationally by name, the 5070 Ti improves on the 4070 Ti by 34%, but the 4070 Ti Super is the more recent price replacement, so the lead over the 4070 Ti Super is just 13%. That's stagnation. We have the RTX 2070 Super in a future test, but the 1070 is in here if you want something older. The improvement over the Pascal GTX 1070, which is now 9 years old, is 332% here. At 1440p, the 5070 Ti ran at 187 FPS average. 1% and 0.1% lows are where they should be based on other results, so there's nothing exceptional here. The 5070 Ti outranks the 4070 Ti Super by just 15 FPS, or only 9%. Sadly, this is one of the better ones, but that's still brutal, and it makes this one of the most boring improvements possible when considering the MSRP similarity, and that's before you go and get ripped off for more. As for the other 70 class cards, the 5070 Ti's uplift over the 4070 Ti is 24%, then 72% on the 3070 Ti, 94% on the 3070 non-Ti, and 307% on the 1070. The uplift has diminished for each of these as resolution came down to 1440p, despite the 5070 Ti not being anywhere close to a CPU ceiling. AMD's RX 7900X TX leads the 5070 Ti by 13%, up from 7% at 4K. The 5070 Ti also leads the 7900 XT by just 9% here. At 1080p, things get even worse. The 5070 Ti leads the 4070 Ti Super by only 6%, or just 15 FPS average, over the 4070 Ti non-Super, which remains an absolutely absurd distinction to need to make. We're only seeing a 16% advantage on the 5070 Ti. No wonder NVIDIA wants everyone to type a frame rate into a calculator and multiply it artificially for MFG. The new card is just 10% over the 7900 XT, then 74% over the 3070 Ti. Black Myth Wukong is up now, tested at 4K. We're removing the experimental chart labeling and feel that this test has had enough public visibility to clear that bar. The 5070 Ti ran at the exact same frame rate as the 4080. NVIDIA has basically re-released the 4080 again, and the price isn't even that different, and in some cases, not different at all. In other words, NVIDIA has now released 3 RTX 4080s. This is the third one, and actually it would be the fourth if they stuck to their original plan of the 4080 12GB instead of the 4070 Ti. At some point, it just seems like this is too much.
It was too much. Last night I said, this is too much. This morning I said, this is too much. And now I realize it's too much.
The 7900 XTX matches the 5070 Ti here. The difference is irrelevant and unnoticeable. Against the 4070 Ti Super's 45 FPS average, the 5070 Ti leads by 13%, or 27% over the 4070 Ti non-Super, and similarly over the 7900 XT. The lead over the 3070 Ti is 81%. At 1440p, the RTX 4080 V3, or maybe V4, ran at 87.2 FPS average, with lows at 74.9 and 70.3. The third iteration of the 4080 isn't the best one though. The first version of the 4080 and the second version of the 4080 are within error of each other, but on the V3, aka the 5070 Ti, NVIDIA has enabled multi-fiat generation to make it more interesting.
Only gamers know that joke.
The memes will continue until morale improves, which apparently will be never. The RX 7900 XTX is about the same as the 5070 Ti here, with the 4070 Ti Super just below it. The 5070 Ti is only 10% ahead of the 4070 Ti Super and 20% ahead of the 4070 Ti, with a similar lead over the 7900 XT. At 1080p, the 5070 Ti is again roughly tied with the 7900 XTX, although credit to NVIDIA for having improved 0.1% lows, just not by an amount anyone would notice in play. The frame time pacing is still good on both. The 4080 Super and 4080 are again within error of each other, and although they're outside of the error versus the 5070 Ti, the real error is the GPUs we launched along the way. The 5070 Ti ends up leading the 105 FPS average 4070 Ti Super result by a staggering, mind-blowing 9.7%, made only more impressive by the fact that this was already functionally the same as the 4070 Ti's 100 FPS. 7900 XT sits just below this. Starfield is up now. At 4K, the 5070 Ti ran at 68 FPS average, this time allowing the 4080 the important distinction of being technically better. The 5080 only leads the 5070 Ti by 12% here as well. Troublingly, for the 5070 Ti in this test, the 7900 XT nearly matches the 5070 Ti, with the 7900 XTX ahead of it by 13%. The 4070 Ti Super and 4070 Ti aren't that different from each other in this one either. At 1440p, the 4080 Super and 4080 are exactly tied, with the 4080 Sub-Super, or as NVIDIA calls it, the 5070 Ti, at 101 FPS average. You might be wondering why NVIDIA would launch 3 4080s, but wonder not.
The more you buy, the more you save. That's right.
That's right. The more 4080s you buy, the more you save other people from buying them. The 5070 Ti ends up basically tied with the 7900 XT. The 7900 XTX holds an advantage at 11% ahead. The 5070 Ti's improvement, if you can call it that, over the 4070 Ti Super is an impressively boring 3.9%, with the lead over the 4070 Ti at 11%. That's, again, impressive, mostly because we're impressed NVIDIA could make something so impressively stagnant. At 1080p, Starfield has the 5070 Ti below the XTX, which has a slight lead at 6%. More impressively, the 4070 Ti Super ran at 120 FPS average. Between the 5080, the 4080s, the 5070 Ti, and the 4070 Ti Super and the 4070 Ti, NVIDIA has managed to make a video card for seemingly every individual frame rate between 110 and 132 FPS. Why they do this? Well, we don't know. Dragon's Dogma 2 is up now. This one has the Asus RTX 5070 Ti Electrolyte, which is what the games crave, at 73.6 FPS average. That's right between the 4080 Super and 7900 XTX, making the 5070 Ti the first NVIDIA RTX 4080 Super on the market. We won't be impressed until they launch the SSS Super tier. The 5080's lead over the 5070 Ti is just 15%. That small of an uplift is going to weigh on NVIDIA.
everything I'm showing today are very heavy.
The 5070 Ti leads the 4070 Ti Super by 18% and the 4070 Ti by 35%. The 7900 XT sits between the two 4070 Ti variants. 1440p reduces the 5070 Ti's relative ranking, pushing it below the 4080 and 4080 Super, the two of which are tied and within error of each other. The 4070 Ti Super's 106 FPS average results also makes for a boring positioning of the 5070 Ti. Again, we're back to a card for every couple FPS. More than ever, this means price matters more. The 7900 XTX leads the 5070 Ti by about 6 FPS here. At 1080p, the RTX 5070 Ti's 151 FPS average basically ties it with the 7900 XTX, which itself is tied with the 4080, which is tied with the 4080 Super, which is a waste of chart space on this one, so it's not shown. Generationally, the 5070 Ti leads the 4070 Ti Super by 10% and 4070 Ti by 18%. Resident Evil 4 is up now, first rasterized. The 4K test has the 5070 Ti at 107 FPS average with the 5080 at 122 and leading by 15%. Both are behind the 7900 XTX at 126 FPS average. The 5070 Ti is ahead of the 4070 Ti Super by 20% and the 4070 Ti by 34%. The 7800 XT is between these and the regular 4070, followed by the older 3070 Ti at 53 FPS average. At 1440p, the 5070 Ti is just below the 4080. The 5080 leads the 5070 Ti by 13%. NVIDIA basically took what previously would have been a 51 FPS gap from 224 to 173 FPS between the 4070 Ti Super and 5080, and then it split the difference with the 5070 Ti. The 7900 XTX is ahead by 17%, with the XT just below the 5070 Ti. We're moving to ray tracing games now. We'll start with Black Myth, which is heavily NVIDIA favored, and then we'll look at some games that are mixed or lighter workloads. At 4K, with upscaling as defined in the chart header, the 5070 Ti ran at 52 FPS average and tied the 4080 and 4080 Super. The 5080's 59 FPS result had it 13% ahead. Over the 4070 Ti Super, we see a 15% lead for the 5070 Ti. AMD gets absolutely crushed in this test, unfortunately for them. At 1080p and still ray traced, the 5070 Ti ran at 112 FPS average and led the 4080. The 5080 is improved on the 5070 Ti by 9%. The proximity of cards from the 4070 through the 5080 is crazy though. We have the 4070 at 80 FPS, then the Ti at 92, then the Ti Super at 95, then the 4080 at 106, the 4080 Super, which isn't shown but is the same, and then the 5070 Ti at 112. Then we have the 5080 at 122 FPS. Dragon's Dogma 2 at 4K with ray tracing is next. In this one, the 7900 XTX is more competitive and lands at 66 FPS average, which is between the 5080 and 5070 Ti. It's unfortunate that AMD gets crushed so hard in some of the other games like Black Myth Wukong, because it does okay in the ones that are less crazy intensive. The 5070 Ti ends up basically tied with the 4080 Super, which is basically tied with the 4080. The jump over the 4070 Ti Super's 54 FPS average is 18% here. 1440p positions the 5070 Ti between the 4070 Ti Super and the 4080. It's not clear why this card needs to exist, but it does. The improvement against the 4070 Ti Super is just 10.8%. The 7900 XTX runs at 108 FPS average and is between the 4080s and the 5080. Let's move on. At 1080p, the 5070 Ti ran at 131 FPS average and was roughly tied with the 7900 XTX. The 4080 leads the 5070 Ti here by a few percent. The 5070 Ti leads the 4070 Ti Super by 9%. Followed by the 7900 XT in the middle ground, and then the 4070 Ti at 16%. In Resident Evil 4 at 4K with ray tracing and upscaling, the 5070 Ti ran at 118 FPS average and tied the 4080 and 4080 Super exactly. It's within run-to-run variance and error. The 7900 XTX leads in this lightweight RT workload with a 14% advantage, posting a big difference from the heavier Cyberpunk and Black Myth workloads that we run. At 1440p with the same settings, we see a similar lineup. The 5070 Ti is again within error of the 4080 and 4080 Super, which are the same. The 7900 XTX is slightly improved. The 4070 Ti Super is slightly behind, and this is uninteresting. Efficiency's up now. We've explained this test in the past, so we'll just get to the results. Efficiency remains a relatively new test for us to include in each review, so we haven't rerun the 4070 cards for efficiency just yet. In Final Fantasy XIV at 4K, the 5070 Ti landed at 0.37 FPS per watt. It pulled 264 watts in this test, approaching its TDP spec. The 5080 ends up slightly more efficient, with the 4080 Super equivalent. The 7900 XTX is at a large disadvantage here due to its power consumption. In Final Fantasy XIV at 1440p, the 5070 Ti ended up at 0.73 FPS per watt, which has it just below the 4080 and 5080. The 5070 Ti improves on the 4060 class cards, but also is significantly more efficient than the 7900 XTX. In Black Myth Wukong at 1080p, we found the 5070 Ti to be between the 4080 Super and 5080 for efficiency. The 7900 XTX shows again that this is its weakness, but its particular performance deficiency in Black Myth in general is hurting it disproportionately. In ray tracing performance with F124, we found the 5070 Ti to perform about the same as the 4080. The 7900 XTX scores significantly lower. Overall here you're seeing much lower numbers than in some of the other charts, and that's because there's a heavy ray tracing workload tested with the higher resolution as well. All of this means that NVIDIA is basically just selling you an RTX 40 series card, maintaining elevated prices, and doing so while pushing DLSS 4 and MFG as the only real differentiating factor on the 50 series. We already have a piece up talking about the new transformer model versus the prior CNN model for DLSS, so you can find that on the channel for a deep dive. But what you're looking at right now and what you've been looking at are some preview clips of our upcoming video, which we have 100% completed and it's going up likely tomorrow with an image quality comparison. This includes a frame by fake frame breakdown of MFG, where we analyze the AI or the synthetic or the fake frames against the keyframes or the native frames. We do this at 2x and with MFG 4x, some of which you're seeing on the screen now. And the improvements in things like the transformer model over the older CNN model for image quality are apparent. Meanwhile, the generated frames serve their purpose of smoothing, but sometimes look bad. What they don't do is turn 20 FPS or 25 or 30 FPS or whatever into an instantly playable great frame rate. This is something we described in our previous piece. But as far as the image quality, it's highly situational. In some situations, DLSS ends up better than native because game developers have decided to ruin their games with terrible default options, which shouldn't happen. But there's also a lot of scenarios where it looks awful. We found bugs in the driver override as well that NVIDIA has pushed to the public. This includes sometimes it incorrectly running the generated frames in the wrong places. That'll all be in our image quality video though. This quick thermal chart looks at steady state during a looping 4K Port Royal workload, and it shows the GPU and memory results. We don't have other 5070 Ti cards to compare, so we can't produce a like-for-like comparison. The 5080s are only here for reference. The 5070 Ti came in 2 dBA quieter than the Zotac 5080 Solid, and was warmer while operating at a significantly lower reported power during the test. The Asus cooler is favoring noise here, but it's also just not particularly effective. Overall, the performance is fine. This is more than acceptable and well below throttle territory, but this does seem to be one of the lower cost coolers for its size. Acoustic testing is up next. We'll keep this brief. As quickly as possible, our chamber is about to get way better for future testing, or more accurately, our microphone equipment. We've recently learned that with a microphone upgrade, we can bring down the noise floor closer to 5 dBA, which is crazy exciting. Currently though, we're on our more economical equipment. With the current noise floor of 14 to 14.5 dBA, we measured the Asus 5070 Ti Prime at 29.2 dBA with this frequency spectrum plot. We observed one spike at around 300 Hz. Otherwise, it follows what we've seen in other cards. The fall off begins at 2000 Hz, levels briefly at 3500 to 5000, then continues the path. The loudest range is 1000 Hz to 1800 Hz, aside from the 300 Hz spike. These two lines show the Zotac 5080 and NVIDIA 5090 FE. The cooler should track about the same, as long as the fan RPM is the same between the other 5080 and 5090 alternatives by the same vendor. The NVIDIA card had a spike around 180 Hz and another at around 380 Hz. The Zotac card had one in the 430 Hz range, and broadly, the NVIDIA FE is louder than both of these. Well, this will change as the prices move in the future, but we don't review the future. We review what's shipping and reality. And currently, reality says that this entire situation is absurd. And for those of you who've been around a long time watching GN, first, thank you. But secondly, you might remember this. It feels an awful lot like sort of the 2020 era of GPU launches. For now, the simple version is we don't recommend buying the 5070 Ti, not only because the pricing is it's just not great. I mean, you're looking at the third or fourth iteration of a 4080 now, and it's really not that different in what the real world actual street price is going to be. And that's even in the future, ignoring the initial launch frenzy. So we just don't recommend it, but let's just recap as quickly as possible some of the data for those of you who jumped here. Broadly speaking, we found that the 5080 performs in the range of 9% to 16% better than the 5070 Ti, depending on the resolution of the game. The 7900 XTX is often better than the 5070 Ti in rasterized testing, with the range in our games spanning equivalents to 17% at the high end, but more commonly 6% to 13%. There were some instances of regression for the 7900 XTX versus the 5070 Ti, but as has been the case, it only really got crushed in Black Myth or Cyberpunk type ray tracing. The 5070 Ti only improves on the 4070 Ti Super by a range of 3.9% or 2.2 if you go down to 1080p, and that wasn't even CPU bound, to 20% at the highest end, and it's often 12 to 16% if you're looking at the heavier resolutions. That is not a good improvement for a generational jump, especially considering the important factor that we're talking about sort of the middle of the average range. That means there's worse improvements like we just mentioned, and the actual street price as expected to the 4070 Ti Super's original street pricing. So street to street pricing, we're not talking to MSRP to street here, especially with instances below 10% performance. It's an awful value. Remember that the Super Series was regularly in stock for its actual MSRP. And so the actual price of the 5070 Ti, we can't see it in advance in a review. We don't review the future. We don't know what the prices will land on launch day around when the video goes up. But based on what we've seen with the 5080 and 5090, our strongest recommendation right now is to just wait in general to buy a video card. Just let it calm down. Anyway, finally, the 5070 Ti is equal to the 4080 Super. We don't care what MSRP the 4080 was. It was stupid. The 4080 Super effectively overwrote that MSRP, and that was $1,000, and it was actually available around $950 to $1,050 for a lot of its life, recently especially at the $950 mark before it went out of stock. Now, for the rest, I mean, AMD really needs to not fuck this up, and we're not sure what they're going to do. So it comes down to pricing. AMD traditionally has taken this really strange approach where they change the prices sometimes within literal days of launch, and sometimes like 3 months after launch. But it's basically an accepted constant that whatever AMD says its price is, it's going to come down in like 1 quarter because they're going to push it way too high. They're going to do the NVIDIA minus $50, and for some reason realize once again, oh wait, that's not good enough because they just buy, there's already NVIDIA minus $50. It's other NVIDIA. So AMD really can't screw this up for the rest of us, but we don't know what that outcome is going to be. They have publicly said they're not going to make a high on this generation. It's deeply disappointing because you look at the 7900 XTX on these charts now, where at launch, the 7900 XT and the XTX, it was easy to be critical of them, but then you look at the follow-ups, like when we did a 7900 XT follow-up and it was $700 or something, and it started to become more favorable. And so it's that regular tick of AMD chooses a price, has absolutely no confidence in it, and it gets shaken into a lower price pretty quickly thereafter, and again, sometimes even before the launch technically. So we don't know what they're going to do, but they are part of this discussion too, because NVIDIA is able to do the things it does because it controls the market. And it's not NVIDIA's responsibility to let its competitors catch up. Likewise, if its competitors don't want to, they're happy with status quo or they're off doing data center or whatever, then fine. But as a consumer, we just think right now is not a good time to buy a GPU. There are some positives. The positives are on the overclocking side. If you're on an older generation card, depending on what generation it is, there is sometimes a huge amount of headroom where on the lower end, you might be looking at like 10% gains or something. But if you really spend some time on an OC, or especially you start digging around for custom vBIOS, there's a lot of caveats there to be careful of, but you start doing stuff like that, you go back far enough, there were times when you could get like 20 to 30% gains from a card. And we've shown some of that recently with one of our 1080 Ti revisits, I think it was. So there's some room there. Don't forget about overclocking to just try and stretch the life out a little longer. If you're kind of like on that edge where it's a little stuttery in the games you like, but it's not completely unplayable, you might be able to just do some tuning and try to stretch it one more generation, which is something we'd always recommend. Obviously, if you want to build a computer just because it's fun, go for it. But if you don't need to and you have no interest in doing that, you just want to be able to play the games at a frame rate you like and you're on the borderline, keep that in mind. Another thing that's positive is that there are a lot of interesting and good components launching right now. It just seems to be the GPU market that's totally fucked. So on the CPU side, the 9800X video is very exciting, and the 5090 kind of continually proved that because it could actually keep up even in some of these 1080p situations. And then coolers, cases, we've gotten into fan testing. That's really fun. So trying to throw out some like, hey, there's positive stuff that's going on. it just does not appear to be in the GPU market right now. We've been through these cycles before. We'll go through them again. And really, it's just that these vendors, they need to be kicked in the ass a little bit to realize, like, oh, wait, like we've found the limit of what the market will bear, and we need to adjust. Anyway, that's my spiel for this one. So our recommendation, don't buy it. And subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly because, well, I don't think I did tell people not to watch this video like 3 minutes into it. So that's it. Subscribe for more. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.